Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagan and a guest who ultimately to this audience we know needs no introduction, but he's going to introduce himself anyway. It's a big week. First episode being recorded in February 2023. Dmitry, how are you?
I'm doing great, Connor, and I'm excited to have our guest over here. It's been a pretty hectic fortnight, I'd say. Lots of news to speak about, but of course, news aside, I think we just have some questions and just want to discuss, the current year or maybe the past 2 years with our great guest here. So I'll let you introduce him, Conrad.
We are, of course, joined tonight by the estimable Dyer, author, live streamer, apologist, geopolitics and movies commentator. He does it all. We've, of course, been following his work for a long time. He shares our stuff, and we really appreciate it. Jay, how are you this evening?
I'm doing great, guys. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's really great to have you here, and we could talk about all sorts of different things on this episode here, but we want to hop right into some current events, some current things going on, and how they relate to the history of psyops, intelligence, all that sort of thing. So, I guess the first question we want to talk about, let's get into some things with Jordan Peterson, actually. I think that'd be a good place to go. Recently, Jordan Peterson, he's been working with the Daily Wire. He's got some good content, some interesting stuff coming out, some other things that aren't as interesting. He recently talked about Iran and the need to, I guess, kind of seed ideas in the American public about a possible war with Iran. This, of course, comes as the war rhetoric in Ukraine is almost kind of, I would say, in the public eye, there's kind of a Ukraine fatigue. And then we're also seeing the whole China thing going on. Jay, what do you think is the current state of I guess, war-based psychological operation in the US and the future that I guess the Atlantic Empire has for the wars around the world that we're experiencing today?
Well, I think everybody knows about the older alignments, coming out of the Cold War that are, I guess, still there, still very relevant. And so my guess would just be that the hotspots relate to those old Cold War hotspots, such as the relationship with China, the relationship with Russia, the relationship with Iran, all of which would be conceived in varying degrees as anti-Western. But of course, in my view, especially when it comes to places like China or perhaps even the fifth column within Russia, there are aspects that would like to see these powers also integrated into some sort of future synthesis or future, mega state. So I don't know exactly what the outlines are for future conflicts per se, but I know that, all of the conflicts that we're seeing just seem to be new instantiations of the Cold War.
What's interesting is so Iran's been in the crosshairs for I think decades now since the Cold War, as you mentioned. But I think the key thing I think that I'm noticing at least is, at least domestically in the US, there was this fatigue of, let's not fight overseas in the Middle East anymore, especially after Trump and Biden pulled out of Afghanistan, and of course Iraq has left a really bad taste in the mouth of veterans and patriots alike. And to have somebody like Jordan Peterson kind of slightly hint at the fact that Iran should be invaded because it's a misogynistic nation, and kind of using that talking point on his personal podcast, I think has really thrown a lot of controversy on Twitter. I'm not sure how to view it. I mean, I don't personally view it in a positive light, and I'm not sure if Jordan's really controlled. Maybe this is his actual personal opinion. What do you think about that?
I don't know. I mean, my immediate suspicion would be that, if he's working for the Daily Wire, then he's going to default side with the Israeli policy in the Middle East. And I feel sure that the situation with why Iran is an issue ultimately relates to that, right? It relates to the seven nation plan. It relates to the micronation Oded Yanan plan of creating the microstates in the Middle East for the greater Israel. So that would be my guess as to why he takes that view. I don't know how adept he is at geopolitics. I guess he met with Netanyahu, but I don't know that he really knows anything about the Cold War beyond what he kind of talks about in some of the talks relating to Soviet gulags and Solzhenitsyn and this kind of stuff. But yeah, beyond that, I don't know what his motivations would be other than what is probably the case with just where he works. And maybe he's sort of, he seems to sort of have this neocon sort of default mode within him. And I think everybody boomer does, because he typically just sort of goes back to classical liberalism and classical liberal talking points. Now, he does say a lot of true things, so I'm not trying to be overly critical because I think he's insightful. But then at other times, the solutions that we get is just sort of like, oh, we just need more classical liberalism. It's like, really? I mean, there's nothing else that we have to offer beyond just more of the same for the last several centuries. I mean, you know what I mean?
Well, and I think the most charitable thing I'll give to Jordan is he's an older guy. He views the past as it wasn't as crazy and woke as everything now, but he is just kind of unwilling to let go of whether it's something like Jung when it comes to his biblical interpretation or something like
Yeah.
classical liberalism when it comes to his politics. He seems really
Right.
stuck in what propelled him in academia to the forefront without realizing that no, you exceeded there before you started challenging the ideas that would kind of fix the problem where we are right now. I think, and a lot of
Yeah, I
people that
think that
followed him back to Christianity need to come to some of those conclusions as well.
it's just sort of the same old Cold War dialectics. That's why I keep kind of going back to that stuff, because I don't mean to beat a dead horse. It's just like people in his generation, they don't they don't seem able to think beyond that era's propaganda of dialectics. And I think that what I always try to push, and it's not because I, have some favoritism to some other country or something like that. It's just because I've read enough on this topic that I think that it really is the case that the Cold War is largely manipulated dialectic. And I think that people who run things intentionally want to create a synthesis out of that, which is a larger global world economic great reset, Fabian socialist global project. And so that's why it's not, in my view, it's not helpful falling back into those boomer neocon era dialectics. And so I think we need to get past that. So while I agree with, again, I think in terms of the gender stuff, in terms of the insights and critiquing things, the Jungian psychoanalysis, there's a lot of insights in Jordan Peterson. But on the geopolitical model, and I agree with him that communism is not good, sure, but that doesn't mean that, okay, then I'm going to just default to neoconservative neoliberalism as if that's good.
Exactly. And in many ways, these narratives, Cold War, World War II, those are still, especially to boomers and even some Gen Xers, the defining narrative
Right.
that we still have to contend with if you want to even get to truth or basic understanding of what's going on in the world. But those narratives couldn't come without what happened in World War I and even what happened in the wars of the 19th century before that. So I want to get your perspective. We've heard a lot you talk about this very true idea just the fact that World War I was ultimately planned by the British, the Atlantic Empire, to destroy Austro-Hungary and the Russian Empire as the two kind of main enemies of the British merchant seafaring empire. And I'm wondering also your perspective on the German Empire at the time, because we know Spengler and others have talked about the danger that would come if the two land empires, whether it was Germany and Russia or also Austro-Hungary being a more land empire, then forming against that sea empire, and how the German Empire plays into that narrative as well as Iran, as we were just talking about. Iran as, I would say, kind of that heartland empire of the Middle East that has always been targeted by what I would say Israel in this case is the British. Like they would represent the British in this scenario. So I think this pattern really repeats itself around the empire zones, you could call them, of the world. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, well, and Israel began when it was, established that it was an outpost of the British Empire. That was its original function. Now, of course, the British Empire doesn't really exist anymore, but what does exist is the Anglo-American Atlanticist Empire that Quigley talks about. And, Quigley is just so key here to understand, in my view, this whole 20th century shakeup, because, as you said, the two world wars, according to Quigley, were for the purpose of the Atlanticist power bloc exhausting and depleting their two main rivals, and, as you intimated there, keeping those two out of a union. So anything that fosters a division between Austro-Hungarian Empire and Russia was necessary for the Atlanticist strategy. And it was also necessary, in their view, to not just do the two world wars, but also the Cold War. So when Quigley was writing Tragedy and Hope, he was writing, kind of in the midst of the Cold War in the 1960s, reflecting from the CFR archives on the two previous world wars. And he admits that, this was a key strategy to keep Germany and Russia from having any alliance. And I think that Bolshevism really played a key role in that, because not only was Bolshevism exported to Russia, as everyone knows, from the West, from the elites, from the American Industrial Corporation, Morgan, Rockefeller, banking interests, all putting money into the Bolshevik Revolution. There was also a brief German Bolshevik Revolution that occurred, so that the intention was to have Bolshevism in Germany too. That only lasted a few months. I think that there was like a few months of a Bolshevik government in Germany around that time before it turned into something else. and then later would become obviously the fascists. But point being is that, yeah, that's what was behind this. And when you get, deeper into these big geopolitical strategists, that's what they say. And if anybody thinks that Sutton, who is one of the key references for this, is, too far out there, well, I would have you know that in Brzezinski's Between Two Ages, he actually cites Sutton as one of his academic sources for talking about the Cold War as a dialectic. So he actually admits that Sutton was correct on this. I mean, unless we just don't believe Brzezinski, but that would be kind of silly to not believe, one of the key dialecticians of that period. And Brzezinski starts off with, I think, at least two of his books by saying that the East-West shakeup of the Cold War was a dialectic. Now, he doesn't call it managed, but to me, I kind of think he's saying it is. But and this was to take all of these countries and restructure them for a long-term game of technocracy. I don't know that in the 1900s, when Bolshevism first entered Russia, I'm not sure that all of the technocrats, or excuse me, all the industrialists who had put money into the revolution, that they necessarily knew for sure there would be a technocracy down the road. But it wasn't too much long after that you had Western supporters for Bolshevism actually saying that it was for that, right? So when we get up to the time of H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, they're actually writing and saying that they're big supporters of Bolshevism because they see it as, quote, a science experiment, that basically technocratic scientific governance as an experiment. And so how well that played out would be, in their minds, how successful this could be for a whole global approach. But they weren't committed to that necessarily. So if Bolshevism failed, it's okay. They can reformulate, regroup, re-strategize. And that's essentially what we see with the same powers basically behind, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank. These are all the same institutions set up by the exact same people to retool and repurpose whatever projects failed during the Cold War for this final Hegelian synthesis that we're going into with Davos's plan, Great Reset, and all that.
Absolutely, and I think one of the themes being actually recycled from that Cold War period, and one of the themes which kept the technocracy in both the USSR and the US alive, was this fear of the greatest evil that can occur to mankind, nuclear war, which I think I've seen in the last year and a half. I mean, we can say almost the year of the Ukrainian conflict. I've not heard the word nuclear war used more in the last 2 decades. So we've seen the word nukes used by, both Zelensky and the NATO side. We've seen the French president, even Macron openly say, well, nuclear warfare wouldn't lead to the end of the world. It's not an acceptable scenario, but it's a possibility. So we have these world leaders essentially openly talking about it, and it's almost like you can say, predictive programming in a way, or at least they're bringing back that idea of the proliferation of nuclear warfare, this fear of, hey, it might actually happen. Everybody, give us more money or send more aid to Ukraine to prevent it from occurring, or who knows what the actual agenda is. It's similar to how perhaps during the pandemic they used the fear of the actual pandemic itself as a way to, convince people in order to buy into certain strategies and whatnot. But now at the moment, we just wanted to get your thoughts, Jay, on the fact that, hey, the word nukes has been used over the last year and maybe a bit more than ever before, and probably maybe even both of our lifetimes, I would say, since the 60s, since the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's really, I think, a little bit unprecedented. I'm not sure what's behind all of this.
Yeah, I was just turning in Quigley to the section where he discusses it, because he's really insightful on this point, because he talks about the stories that were used after the bombing, of Nagasaki and all that they realized that how powerful these stories were for just as propaganda stories. Now, I'm not saying that people misunderstood me, like that I think nuclear fission isn't real, or I never said anything like that. What I was saying was that Quigley explains the power of the nuke as a psyop. That's all. I'm not saying that there's not nuclear power. I'm saying that the power, it doesn't require a lot of nukes going off to scare the crap out of people, because Quigley points out that a lot of what was going on with the AEC, which is the Atomic Energy Commission, he says, this is not me, he says that a lot of this wasn't even people who were involved in science. There were some scientists, but the AEC was mainly made up of people involved in banking and propaganda. And so if you look at Quigley's page 894 and 895, he talks about how the main usage of all of this nuke stuff was for the United Nations to erect its Security Council. So the United Nations Security Council would have never existed without all of the so-called nuclear proliferation. But the point is that they seem to have wanted there to be this ever-present fear of the nuke for the UN to have its justification. And when we read Bertrand Russell, he basically says the same thing too. He says the reason we need world governance and technocracy is because of nukes. He says that that's the number one reason. He says because anybody can get a hold of a nuke now, and anybody can destroy the world with nukes. And again, this is all just in my view ridiculous fear mongering, right? And to back up Quigley's analysis there, if you go to Alex Abea's book on history of the Rand Corporation, I mean, Abea basically says the same thing about the whole psychological operation of nuclear fears in the Cold War. Again, not saying that there can't be bombs going off or that's not possible, but that the real power in the nuclear story is the story, right? And it's much more useful as a story than it is for actually destroying entire continents, right? I mean, do you see what I'm saying? Like, because if you destroy an entire continent, then presumably your continent will be destroyed as well, right? So this doesn't really, there's not much advantage in this, but there is a lot of advantage to the perpetual fear of it, which justifies a lot of these globalist bureaucracies and globalist control structures. And that's the point I'm trying to make. That's what they say.
Well, just think about mutually assured destruction. Oh yeah, mutually assured destruction only benefits those who have powerful intelligence apparatuses. They can wage complete hybrid warfare against any state they want because every state's now afraid to move any kind of military capacity around because at any point, supposedly, they could just get blown up. And it also pairs into the whole energy thing because now it's controversial when a country even wants to supposedly adopt fission and now supposedly fusion developing energy.
Yeah,
so
it's
now
more
you
of
can
a
basically
control.
prevent.
Exactly.
Yeah,
you can justify any of your moves by this. Is what I'm trying to say.
No, I completely agree.
That's what Russell says. He's like anybody who doubts our move for global governance and who doesn't want that. He basically says you want nuclear war and you're guilty when the rogue state set off the nukes. I mean, it's like,
yeah.
But
I've heard that kind of narrative before.
Another thing he also says is funny is that he says that it's the fault of man that nukes have been created. And he's like, humans have become reckless and they want war and they're going to destroy the planet. And so I'm not joking. He actually says that we need to get rid of humans because they created nukes because they're going to destroy the planet. And then he turns around and he says, humans are, scientific geniuses, the elite, he's saying, are the scientific geniuses. And he said, because we created these wonders like nuclear power. So now, wait a minute, is nuclear power something that you blame the masses for and that they need to be destroyed because they created this thing? But also it's like this great genius invention that the elite came up with. You see what I'm saying? Like he's so he's so slimy and contradictory like that.
Well, this leads into something really relevant today, and this leads us into Davos and the WF as well. And I don't know if you saw this when Alex Karp, who's the CEO of Palantir and ex-CIA, he said that their software single-handedly stopped the far right in Europe due to supposedly ending Islamic terrorist attacks and catching them before they occur, as well as his product built the same Palantir and their associated things that Alex Karp is in charge of helped spread the COVID narrative. So like it's really just showing how supposedly this person with their technology and their control of this narrative and their ability to prevent what you could call the logical conclusions of multicultural policy and left-wing policy in Europe, they've put in so much effort to control the narrative surrounding that someone goes to Davos and could just claim that their software stopped the rise of like fascism or the right wing or whatever reaction would have come against the tide of multiculturalism in Europe. I'm wondering your thoughts on that and the WEF this year, 2022 in general, 2023 rather.
So I did pay quite a bit of attention to Davos this year because I think my first Davos video was 2016 or 2017. So it's something that I have had on my radar for a good while now. I've read a significant amount of Klaus's works as well as other attendees, and I've looked into the history of Davos. So it represents one of these sort of steering committee front piece operation. So, it's basically the people from Bilderberg have a more public version of Bilderberg, which is what I think Davos is, World Economic Forum. And this comes out of the period during the Cold War when Kissinger, through Harvard, it's called the Harvard Research Project, They wanted to set up another one of these steering committees after they basically set up a million other ones. And so he came up with the idea to recruit Klaus, and it was actually a CIA operation. So Klaus was recruited via a CIA project known as World Economic Forum in Davos. And it's all the same suspects, all the same people who, according to David Rockefeller's memoirs, it was him, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, the SS guy, and some other, very wealthy people who basically set up Bilderberg. So Bilderberg is the root of Davos. Davos is public Bilderberg. I think Klaus used to be the steering committee guy for Bilderberg at one point. So it's all the same corporate elite of the West. This thing, Atlantis' corporate elite. And so I'm not surprised that Palantir, would be there saying that, claiming that. They've been claiming these kinds of things for a long time. And that's what a lot of internet security, private security internet companies have been championing, that they can steer narratives, they can prevent crimes. Pre-crime is what a lot of these people are even pushing now. And really all this is just highly invasive surveillance that sometimes even makes up threats that they, it's like when the FBI provocateurs and then they come in and like bust their own people. See, we stopped a terror event that we ourselves were provocateuring, so we're the heroes. And it's kind of the same thing that I think, in my view, a lot of these.
Well, it's like the Spider-Man meme where everyone's just pointing at each other, and it's like, wait a second, like.
Yeah. So no, I wasn't actually aware that that they were saying that, but I'm not surprised because I think a lot of this stuff is kind of controlled from the top down. I mean, that Klaus was saying for the last few years that the next big thing would be cyber polygon, that we would see, mass internet outages and cyber attacks, and that was all coming to disrupt the West. And it's going to be China, it's going to be Iran, it's going to be Russia. It's all the usual suspects. But we can all recall from the WikiLeaks Vault 7 that actually anything can be spoofed. So that could entirely be the West. You know what I mean? When this happens, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting because Klaus Schwab, just on that same note, he is the only person almost that we've seen that Zelensky actually appears in a suit before and like kind of presents himself in a more or less presentable fashion, at least in 2022. And of course, Zelensky did send his wife, Alyona Zelenska, to actually visit Davos and speak at the WEF as a sort of envoy. So his closest person, the person he loves the most, he's sent as an ambassador of his views. And I think in many ways, just over the Ukrainian conflict in general, like the involvement of the WEF is almost as explicit as say their involvement in the pandemic. It's almost, and people say it could be like a cliche jargon argument. You can say, well, the Ukrainian conflict replaced the pandemic as this sort of issue that the Eye of Sauron stares at and gets everybody's attention, pushes their attention towards it. But right. In many ways, I think that's exactly what it is. And regardless of the actual facts on the ground, the war in the Donbass for 8 years, all of the actual events happening, it does seem like at least for the last year, we're coming up to a year on the 24th of February, the World Economic Forum and all these structures, they do want to point the world's attention towards Ukraine, towards the crimes that allegedly Russia has committed over the last year. And of course, this is all underpinned by, of course, these Bilderberg figures running it in the background of Klaus Schwab, and even more, I think, even more esoteric, I suppose, and this is based on two of the books you've written, Esoteric Hollywood, is just the fact that Zelensky himself is a very esoterically Hollywood character, and in many ways he's not American Hollywood, but he's basically the king of Ukrainian Hollywood. He played a president of Ukraine in the Public Servant TV show, which aired from 2015 until 2019, 3 seasons. So he actually played a president of Ukraine before he was elected president. And I mean, if that's not a psyop, predictable programming sort of mini project, I don't know what is. And of course, you could almost compare him to like an Arnold Schwarzenegger, who famously has attended Bohemian Grove several times. I remember Alex Jones reporting on this during the Obama years. So Arnold Schwarzenegger being a complete Western.
Arnold actually attended Bilderberg too.
Oh wow! Okay, well, there we go. So it's even bigger than that. And so Zelensky is this, I guess, Eastern European version of an Arnold. As weird as it sounds, and the fact that an entire nation follows him and believes him is, it's almost like if the pandemic was a test towards control, Zelensky is like a test towards how far would you follow such a figure.
Yeah, and Ukraine is slated to be. There's multiple reasons why. I know you guys know this, but Ukraine is a key strategic region. Brzezinski actually years before all this had written about what would need to happen in Ukraine. So actually, Brzezinski kind of planned out and stated that there would be this Ukraine conflict, perhaps even all the way back in Grand Chessboard. But also, he mentions Ukraine in Strategic Vision, which I think he wrote around 2015, 16, somewhere in there, maybe 2014. So this was kind of, this was planned out obviously a long time ago, and we know that the Soros color revolution stuff had been there, the Orange Revolution going all the way back to the 80s and 90s. So this was a long time in the works, and that's because the West knows the importance of Ukraine for this, keeping Russia at bay, and breadbasket, all that stuff. Back to Hitler, I mean, and even back to World War I, which is essentially where Ukraine comes from. But Hitler had this same idea, and the existence of these Nazi networks, these Azov battalion, all this kind of stuff, that goes back to World War II as well, because the West, through the Galen network, Otto Skorzeny, all these Nazis that were actually training black ops people in a lot of different intelligence agencies. That's the networks for where all these things come from, going back to World War II. So it's still a key region, still a strategic area, because the West, it's just kind of like it's flipped from new masters, right? Or ultimately, I guess you could say it was always the same masters in the Ukraine. But yeah, and there's also the elements that have come out with the biolabs that were there, and that most likely they might have been working on race-specific, genetic-specific weapons targeted perhaps at Slavs. That's another reason for the conflict. So there's a lot going on with that. But I think that if we know the history of World War II, if we know the Cold War, we know that Ukraine is a key area. And it's also slated to be one of these future like 5G, 6G, Skynet places. So they want to experiment with Ukraine as one of these, like a future smart city state. I don't know if you've seen that, but there's a lot of information that came out, especially in the last year, about what they want to do with Ukraine in regard to like smart city type stuff. So that's another element of this, I think. I think Tristan did a really good video on that. Do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, and not even that. Like even during the pandemic, like Kiev and Lvov, I believe, were two of the main cities that literally had like app your red, yellow, green effect with your vaccine status, with your test. Like it was, and they were able to do this because of just the amount of NATO, NGO, US. It's just an entirely propped up state, so they could just run wild.
And that's why Zelensky was a week or two ago was up there saying, if you want to get good business opportunity, come to Ukraine. If you're a Fortune 100, got good business for you here. I guess you guys saw that clip, right?
Oh yeah, and Larry Fink is like, yeah, we agree, but you got to end this conflict, because he recognizes the rising, like he recognizes the danger the petrodollar is facing right now, and some of these other things that are gonna break his bank if things don't kind of start going the way they need to start going in his mind.
Naturally, and there's all kinds of, say, local corruption as well coming in from the ecclesiological side, kind of off topic, but in the same sort of vein, we are speaking about Ukraine, and you have this absolutely insane schism, which for whatever reason still hasn't ended, and you have not just the schismatics stealing churches from the Orthodox folks, just like they would in the communist period. You'd have things which almost ripped straight out of Archipelago Gulag, and also the early 1930s and 20s, when the Russian church was essentially, when the Bolsheviks created a mirror church. And so you have Zelensky essentially supporting the schismatics as well. So he's not even pretending to be an anti-Christian. He's saying, I'm still supporting Christians, but just not your main church. I'm supporting these schismatics here. And of course, all the crimes follow on from this, where we have, reports of priests getting stabbed, churches being burned down, obviously liturgies being stopped, interrupted by people just coming in and raiding it. All these threats to real estate, bishops
having raised in the churches.
Oh gosh, I have no comments on that. Like, I mean, they were exactly. They were having raves, disco parties, and staging opera plays, like Ukrainian local ones, in the main monastery of Ukraine, which is 1,000 years old. It's as old as Mount Athos. It's essentially like as old as Mount Athos itself, this monastery, and they're staging a play in it. The level of sacrilege here, it's almost akin to a humiliation ritual for the Ukrainian people themselves. It's not even mocking the Russians, but actually mocking the local Ukrainians or the folks who actually lived in this area. It's as if, just saying that, look, we've conquered you, and we're going to make fun of your 1,000-year-old Orthodox Christian tradition, and you're not going to do anything about it. So it really is it's really explicit.
Yeah, and it's important to understand that the Fordham University, the Jesuits, a lot of these groups were already in operation at the same time in parallel with the CIA Soros operations of the color revolutions in the Ukraine, preparing for where we are now for years. That's what the ecumenists and the uniates and the Jesuits were also there in the Ukraine doing to help and to promote. And so they were the ones behind essentially fostering this ecumenist movement there, as well as the evangelical Protestant groups, which also have CIA cover there as sort of fronts for the CIA that Hackert has documented in several of his essays at Soul of the East and an Espionage History Archive. And then we get into the history of the State Department really putting pressure on the EP to recognize the schismatics. In my view, this is just part and parcel with the geopolitical strategy of the color revolutions to politically make the Ukraine into essentially a Western vassal puppet state. Now you do the exact same move by creating a parallel Western CIA puppet church. And isn't that ironic? Because I thought that's what Bolsheviks did. Oh, and then here we are, the CIA doing the exact same thing in the Ukraine and in Macedonia. And so what we see is that this is just a model and a strategy that the geopolitical power does, whether they have a communist ideology, whether they have a socialist, or whether they have a capitalist neoliberal ideology. It's the same strategy of attempting to create your own parallel episcopate that goes along with your puppet government that you put in place. And I've been reading a lot of texts on the history of East German Stasi and their means and methods of infiltrating the Roman Catholic Church. Now, obviously, I'm not Roman Catholic, but I'm very interested in that topic because it's going to be the same model, the same application as to what's happening in the Orthodox world. And I think we're already seeing that. And the reason that matters is that, of course, in the U.S., the Orthodox Church, I expect, is already sort of happening. That they're intentionally, I think, splitting it down the middle. So they want to drive a wedge down the middle, not just to the church in Ukraine or in Macedonia, but everywhere. So essentially, the Orthodox Church, especially in America, is going to be split down the middle between the EP ecumenist, much of the OCA that will go along with that, Go Arch. They want to be under the EP. And then the EP will essentially, for 2025, 2030, they're already talking about the possibility of a new Florence, a new union with Francis. And so that's the ultimate goal here.
Well, and is it so hard to see Ukraine being the vassal for that? Just think of the institutions that are so involved in whether it's ecumenism or Western support in Ukraine. I would say the two biggest institutions, unironically, are the Vatican and the Canadian government. And I don't think there's two institutions that are more thoroughly corrupted to, the neoliberal power that currently is reaping benefits on the world. And it's so, you can just predict what's happening by looking at it. Like the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is going to be it's the quote unquote Orthodox country where the Roman Catholics have the most influence, and we all know why that's happened. That goes back to World War I and II,
right?
And you can see how far back all of these plans go for what fundamentally is. I do believe this. I don't think it's a coincidence that all these zones that are targeted by the government, whether it's Kosovo and Serbia, Ukraine and Russia, Cyprus and Turkey, all these places that are currently in these, whether it's how active or not, whether they're frozen, whether they're not so frozen, these zones. It really all comes down to orthodoxy in a lot of ways. And sure, you have China and Taiwan, but there's just to ignore the targeting of orthodoxy and the canonical church by the empire and the powers that be, I think is just silly. And you mentioned all of the predictions from Brzezinski and these others on what was going to go on in Ukraine. Well, you know who else was predicting all of that? The actual Russian and Ukrainian Orthodox saints of the 20th century. St. Lawrence of Chernigov, St. Seraphim of Vyritsa. Me and Dmitry have talked about these all on the show. They said the exact same thing, that after the fall of the Soviet Union, there will be a little peace, and then there will be a great war in Ukraine, and a schism in the church will come out of Ukraine. And the people in Russia, the Russians, the true believers, will greet the Russian army with joy. Like, that's what the prophecies say, and I've seen countless videos of that exact kind of thing happening. So it seems that you either had to be digging in to the truth of the matter and the hidden texts and the conspiracies, or really reading the words of local Orthodox saints, or else you just weren't going to have this one figured out.
Yeah.
It sounds to me those are the ways to break through the narrative here.
Well, it's amazing the parallels in many of these cases. I mean, you mentioned some there, but there's many as on Mount Athos as well, right? Of people who's like, it's like this. The only people that seem to be really know what's going on is like the elders and Brzezinski and Kissinger, right? That's who knows what's going on, because they end up saying the same types of stuff. Exactly, you're exactly right. That's a great point. Yeah, I mean, I've been reading about John Paul and the alliances with the CIA, particularly during the Cold War, mainly under William Casey, via sort of backdoor networks like Opus Dei. And what happened was, with that, Opus Dei basically offered to pay they gave a lot of money basically to Rome when there was a lot of debt from the pedo scandals and lawsuits. And so by doing that, the exchange there was John Paul gave a special prelature and recognition to Opus Dei. And what that did was that kind of linked them directly with the Vatican Bank. And it became a kind of a funnel for a lot of Cold War propaganda funding, Vatican Bank, mafia operations. I mean, all that kind of stuff is directly connected to that. And what happened with that was that the CIA, mainly through William Casey and Cardinal Casaroli, who was the Vatican state, I guess you call him the Vatican statesman. He's like the Kissinger of the Vatican, maybe. Who's also, by the way, the Vatican's counterintelligence spy, rooter outer guy. So he's the one that would root out all the Stasi and KGB moles in the Vatican, and had a pretty close alliance, obviously, with the CIA. And what happened was that they decided that they would make this direct alliance with the CIA for the Cold War, because, of course, the idea was, well, the worst of these two evils is the communist atheist state. But the problem is that they had now aligned themselves and taken on new masters. And those new masters are the masters of, neoliberal capital. And the masters of neoliberal capital, as I've been thinking more and more about it and looking at the modus operandi of Klaus and all these technocrats, if you look at the Stasi, the way they operated, what they want to bring is actually 10 times worse than the Stasi. Like, what the technocrats want is like the Stasi times 10, with all of the same harassment, social credit score. I mean, all this kind of stuff basically existed in East Germany in a kind of a primitive form. And you would get harassed, and you would get, you couldn't, get necessary foods. You couldn't do this or that. You would have people, following you around. Well, now it's going to be like the purple-haired people eater, Stasi, or actually just an algorithm, right? That's gonna have all this in place. That's what they want. And we'll watch a movie like The Lives of Others, which doesn't, in my view, the point is not to glorify Western neoliberalism versus East German Sovietism or Stasi tyranny. It's actually that the point is that everybody can see that what's in the Stasi mindset is bad. But if that's the case, then what the technocrats are trying to push is 10 times worse than that. So how could anybody not be against the Atlanticist technocratic Great Reset model when it's 10 times worse than the Stasi, which nobody's a huge fan of? I mean, maybe there's somebody who's like a Stasi defender out there. I don't know. But
don't get Haas on here, bro. We just debated Haas. Don't call him back.
I just found it fascinating that, diving into the modus operandi of the Stasi and how they worked is like, hey, this is actually what Klaus and everybody's doing, but like on a global scale, 10 times worse.
And of course, this mirrors exactly what not just what we see in the Ukraine with the SBU, the Ukrainian version of the FBI, KGB. Essentially, they're taking photo shoots outside of the churches, like standing there in their uniforms outside of closed Orthodox monasteries. I'm not sure why they did that photo shoot in the first place. Well, there's like hundreds of photos online of closed Orthodox churches with Ukrainian FBI, SBU troops, essentially officers standing outside, Ukrainian feds, you can say. And it's like, why would they post these photos with the Ukrainian government logo in the corner somewhere? And I'm just like, hold on, is this just it's obviously they're reporting to someone like this is evidence of their work, or I'm not sure. It's kind of hard to put my finger on it, but again, we see this in Ukraine. This version, as you mentioned, of like Stasi, this governmental, shutdown and coercion of Orthodoxy, and pressuring and harassing Christian churches, and the Roman Catholic Church, as an example. Now,
Right.
we saw that in the U.S. as well during the pandemic, in Western countries. I mean, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the UK. That was a version as well of, hey, how far can we push Christians to bend to the state's will, and how many churches can we close, how many masks can we put on people, etc. Like, of course, that's a controversial subject in and of itself, but I think that plus what we see in the Ukraine, these are all, again, they all stem from similar roots, I think, and maybe their inspiration again lies in what the Stasi were doing, what the KGB were doing in the Soviet Union, and maybe even what Hitler was doing.
Klaus has that bust of Lenin behind him, and I understand that later Soviet philosophy wasn't identical to Lenin per se, but I think that he's someone who draws inspiration from these kinds of figures, because the power of Bolshevism was in its ability to create new markets. I mean, that's what Sutton says, is that the real reason that the industrialists and the money power in the West were such big fans of Bolshevism wasn't anything to do with ideology per se, but mainly to do with, when the wrecking ball of Bolshevism comes through, it destroys existing structures, wipes out a lot of the tradition, the heritage, creates a consolidation of markets and money that can then be transferred offshore. So it's basically just a creation of a new market. And we know that, a lot of warfare in the 20th century, a la Smedley Butler, that's essentially what it's about, right? It's about creating new markets, destroying to come in with the contractors and rebuild, et cetera. And I think that's what's going on with Ukraine right now. But it's just ironic to me that how many people, especially the so-called conservatives in the West, or in Christianity in the West, or in the Catholic Church, the trad cats, and even the neocons in the Orthodox world, who love to reminisce over the struggles and the how hard it was to deal with persecution by Soviets during the Cold War of the church, and the Orthodox Church had a parallel structure created that was a fake KGB. And then here they're doing the exact same thing in Ukraine. It's like, what are you talking about? It's the same model that the West, the CIA, is doing in the Ukraine. Are you crazy?
Well, and I think, Jay, that really leads us into some. I want to ask you about this. This might seem a bit of a convoluted question, but I think it gets us to a good place. We were mentioning earlier if you're either paying attention to the elders, or you're uncovering the deep, real conspiracy lore. And from an epistemological perspective, you compare, I would say, orthodoxy, or the consensus patrum, or just the writings of the saints over any given century, maybe the past 200 years. And you compare perhaps what you could call the geopolitics, or the perspective on reality that you might come away with after reading that, compared to, say, a Roman Catholic who follows Fatima and the other things, or the popes and their geopolitical allegiances, or I would say even Islam and some of its geopolitical findings, and other thoughts. Of course, secularism and neoliberalism, we know where that leads you, but these other, Marxism, communism, all these kind of worldviews and perspectives. I really do think that transcending ideology and just reading the saints and understanding orthodoxy and Orthodox history is the way to fundamentally have some clarity in some of these things. And I want to know, as someone who has devoted so much of his time to Orthodox epistemology, how would you bridge those two kinds of things, where, of course, in the philosophical realm, we have presuppositional apologetics, orthodoxy, and Trinitarianism, and the clarity and understanding of knowledge, metaphysics, and ethics that those bring us. But when it comes to these kind of psyops and in this world, I think in many ways the same principles apply in how we can see through that nonsense. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think that one doesn't have to get a bunch of geopolitical texts and tomes to figure out what's going on. One can go that route if you're so inclined, but like you said, I mean, there's a lot of clarity that comes with just a kind of a spiritual simplicity that we find in a lot of the Orthodox elders and writers that discuss these topics. I mean, Paisios, for example, St. Paisios talks very, very clearly about, the movement towards world order. Father Seraphim Rose talks about this movement towards technocratic world order and the world religion, and all these kinds of things. Orthodox and the religion of the future. What is it? The spiritual councils, or I think it's same. I have one of the volumes. I don't have all the four volumes, but
reading them now as well. They're really good.
You can find a lot of this material. It's kind of buried here and there in different, but you're right that they just kind of treat it with just a clear, obvious simplicity. Oh yeah, of course there's a movement for total tracking and tracing, and it's, of course, it's, spirit of Antichrist, and of course it's, involved. It's behind these movements that we see in Ukraine, Macedonia, trying to split the church in America as well. It's coming down to the church in America too. So just get ready for that. It's already happening. Already know about situations in the OCA, where this is, or the OCI, I should say, where this is coming. Not everybody in the OCA is bad. I'm not saying that, but there's a lot of good people there. But there's also a contingent that really wants to persecute along the same lines, these fault lines that we're talking about. But you're right that it could just be bypassed by going to people like you're mentioning.
No, I think as well that like you mentioned, Father Seraphim Rose and these people, a lot of these writings as well with Saint Paisios are written for monks or for simple people, and it's kind of the simplicity of the faith and the complexity that comes with politics, and like people that are like, they're not, you might not say they're conspiracy theorists, they're just really into the news and politics. Like that is exactly the like kind of distractions that come with the mediums that we're in today. And kind of as a follow-up to that last question, on the internet is ablaze with AI, voice deepfakes, video deepfakes. I think it's such a perfect, when we're finding, as it's perfect we're having Jay on, such a fantastic epistemologist, I would say, in his work on presenting that. We're kind of entering, I would say, a new era of discerning truth. And the real takeaway as well is, how long have the governments of the world, or really the powers that really be in the, British, American, Israeli, Atlantic establishment, have been just completely faking us out with completely realistic, deep voice, audio, and video fakes. Like now I have friends, you can run 10 minutes of someone's podcast through it and have perfect audio. It's insane.
Yeah, it's kind of a crisis of credibility. And it's also kind of a deep psyop that certain writers had written about even 20 years ago. I think even Hoffman had mentioned maybe 20 years ago that the emergence of the internet and the never-ending scroll would have this destabilizing effect about people basically not trusting anything. And then what that does is that will kind of put everybody in this position where they're going to default, just assume that this new Deus Ex Machina of AI is now some sort of like superior form of this is like the meta authority now. It'll have this semi-god status. It's already getting that. People on the internet making these dumb videos as if Chat GPT was like going to take over the world, and it's so amazing. So, dude, that thing was like the lamest, wokest. It's just like talking to somebody on Reddit, dude. That thing was garbage. I had about 10 minutes of arguing with it and I was like, this is just comedy clips, man. This is making gold comedy clips for me. I precept that thing, and like in 2 minutes it contradicts. It's like Reddit GPT. That's all it is, dude. It's just total soy wokeness. Now, yeah, maybe there's some super advanced version that DARPA has that we don't know about that's, really gonna screw everything up. That's possible, but I think a lot of that is hype and propaganda, and I see a lot of people, all over YouTube, especially, making all these videos. Oh, Chat GPT is taking over the world. It's everything. It's everything. Nobody's gonna have jobs anymore. I mean, that thing was garbage, dude. I don't know if you guys have played with it, but I would recommend playing with it just for 10 minutes to see how garbage it is. You see how silly it is. I mean, I've asked it like tons of questions, and literally like half of them it can't do. It can't answer. It doesn't know what it is. And the answers are all, especially if you ask about something controversial, the answers are all, super woke, lame. I mean, I just think it's garbage. But it is going to continue to be pushed as this new semi-divine authority figure, and I think it's intended to fill the vacuum. It's a scam, but it's intended to fill the vacuum that people's crisis of credibility is seeking.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this kind of leads into, back in the past, 1,000 years ago, when the schism first occurred, you had, say, the Roman Catholic Church, for example, relying on just launching a bunch of forgeries. And perhaps this is the new millennium's version. Exactly. So, and I even, when I read old Russian texts, like these forgeries, like the donation of the Pope Sylvester to Constantine.
No, dude, they're soy-juries.
Exactly, yeah. And unfortunately, I feel like they can almost... you can imagine an old speech from, say, Putin from 2009. Somebody could go back and sort of just change his words around, and then launch that clip onto YouTube and say, "Hey, look what Putin said in 2009," and nobody will question it. But in fact, it'll be a soldiery. So there we are. I think that's definitely a possibility in the new century. Like, who knows what exactly will come of this, but. Yeah, I just wanted to mention, just for the listeners, for those saying, "Oh, why would Klaus Schwab, this big capitalist, for any socialist-minded folks listening, why would Klaus Schwab have a bust of Lenin in the back? Well, you must understand, Lenin is this almost like a uniting figure for not just the globalists, but also all these various, you can say, forces of Satan around the world. For example, the communists really adore him. He's also maybe one of the perpetrators, not maybe, but definitely a culprit of, Orthodox regicide, essentially. He was in charge of, murdering the Tsar alongside with his family. And on top of that, destroying Russia, persecuting the church quite openly. And the Harvard Ukrainian Studies Journal, which I believe is a quarterly or a monthly journal, in 2018 released the cover art was a statue of Lenin in blue and yellow, painted in blue and yellow from 2018. So even the Harvard University admits that Lenin is the founder of Ukraine, and Putin actually says this on February the 24th when the operation began in his 45-minute opening sort of speech. He says, hey, by the way, in our archives it says Lenin is one of the founders of Ukraine, so why are you guys, Ukraine, you guys shouldn't be neo-Nazis, because your state is founded. But Putin basically took a shot at Zelensky and friends, but Putin was right. And Harvard admits this, and so Lenin is this uniting figure which unites not just liberals, capitalists, communists, Satanists, Bolsheviks, like all these bizarre, dark, it's very interesting. And obviously Lenin also was in some ways a pawn who was sent in as a front man, because even in his speeches he was good at giving speeches. But it's bizarre how they're actually okay with having the front man unite them, whereas the big boys lead from the back. And Zelensky, in many ways, is this new Lenin, is this new Kerensky type figure who's leading from the front, but obviously he's not the guy making these huge decisions. Like, this is what people need to understand. Yeah, so...
Great analogies there. Yeah, the chat GPT is basically papal forgeries today, and then Zelensky is basically kind of a new Lenin. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, look, if people weren't paying attention, though, and just came onto Twitter, they'd think Trump is a Blade fan and that Ben Shapiro has a thing for AOC and whatever else they see these AI do things telling them to believe. They're getting pretty crazy, which is really affecting my decision to maybe have my face on future live streams and episodes if people can run that through an algorithm and make me do and say whatever they want me to. It's a little spooky, I'll be honest.
Yeah, I saw. Did you see the one of Trump talking about how nobody wanted gay Ron Swanson on that TV show?
I didn't see that one. You have to send me that.
Yeah. So if you don't know the video game Last of Us, right? It's like a popular, HBO show now. And the last episode, they had Ron, the guy that plays Ron Swanson, on there, basically being Ron Swanson, but now he's gay.
And then I did hear about the flamboyant homosexuality at the end. Yeah.
Somebody did a Trump. Dude, it sounded just like Trump, right? It's a deepfake of Trump. Like, can you believe this? They've got him gay. Nobody wanted this. This is terrible. And then it's, I can't, a bunch of stuff I can't say on YouTube, but yeah, it's funny.
Yeah, no, people, I mean, I've bookmarked some of them and have saved some of them because I know they're going to get banned, but it's a bit of a free-for-all now, and you realize if people can make these with 10 minutes of footage from a clip and a free thing online, like, let's be honest, are you going to believe, like, is all the footage and things they've supposedly shown you to convince you of some atrocity or some reason to go to war or something, are you going to just jump right on that? I think this is a good reason to not do that in the future.
Exactly. Exactly. Anything else you guys want to get into before we kind of close out my segment?
Honestly, no. Unless there's anything you want to talk about, we're gonna see you in February, bro. I'm gonna see you IRL, and I think I'm looking forward to that. Seeing you in Austin. We've got some buddies coming out from the parish, and
sweet, yeah. Yeah, I want to remind people if they do want to get tickets to the event, you can go to my Twitter, you can go to my website. It's the links to Eventbrite, and it's the event at February 11th, right outside of UT Austin. We'll be having 2 hours of comedy, me and BG Cumby, and then Jamie will be giving her hour and a half talk on Hollywood, AI, and transhumanism, and then I'll be giving my hour and a half talk on apologetics, epistemology, and my meta-narratives book, and then we'll have Q&A and book signing. So it's going to be a lot of fun. Go ahead and get your tickets now. It's basically an all-day event. It's going to be a blast.
Yeah, no, Jay, I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm sure we'll have you on the show again in the future. I recommend everyone watch his interview with Dr. Steve Turley that happened recently. That went really well. We're all very proud of that one. And yeah, no, me and Dimitri are going to get into the news a little bit here, but thank you so much, Jay. And
I would add too that I went pretty deep into the Cold War, John Paul II, the JP2, Alliance of the CIA, Opus Dei, all of that in last night's stream. So if anybody's interested, we did a 3-hour thing on that, as well as how Marian apparitions are tooled for Cold War propaganda, especially Medjugorje Bayside, which I think were obvious, intel psyops that you can go get into that. My stream I did last night, so it's pretty deep.
Yeah, no, we'll have that linked below. We'll also have Jay's philosophy course that he did with Richard Grove. We'll have that linked below, which I think everyone should do. It's especially if you've kind of felt like you're overwhelmed, you're just getting into this stuff, and you feel like you have to watch 47,000 hours of Jay live streams. You should just do the course. I think that's a good thing to do. Support the cause a little bit. But yeah,
right.
Jay, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
We're really grateful for your work, and we appreciate it.
Well, likewise. Keep up the good work, and God bless you guys. Have a good night.
All right. Thank you very much, Jay. That was fantastic. We are going to get into a bit of the news now, do a bit of World War Now normal style, get into things, wrap things up. But in the break that we just took after that clip, it seems that World War III has begun. China has attacked America. There are explosions in the sky over Montana. Total yellow dawn, imminent. China and America are at war. I'm just kidding, of course. I have honestly no idea exactly what's happening. But this whole Chinese balloon thing has really taken the world by storm. We were just talking about how Iran is kind of taking the place of Ukraine and now taking the place of every other distraction. Apparently there are large Chinese surveillance balloons over the heads of every United States civilian. And now there's multiple. Apparently some are coming up from South America. I guess this situation's unfolding. So follow us on Twitter, World War Now _ Telegram, World War Now Telly to keep up with the unfolding situation. But it's definitely, whatever is the case that this is, it'll most likely be used as an excuse and rhetorical escalation against China. We've seen this from Conservative Inc. as well. More people that were always kind of skeptical of the Russia-Ukraine thing are now making it clear. Tucker Carlson, I think, made this clear, even though he did have Jimmy Dore on as well to respond. I give him credit for that. Tucker Carlson expressed some support for a war with China, so it seems that, at the very least, whatever this balloon thing is will be used in that direction, rhetorically speaking, from the United States.
Yeah, definitely. It does seem like a catalyst to sort of shift the discussion back to, maybe what it was like during the Donald Trump trade war with China, but maybe this is even more extreme than a trade war, because the trade war on one hand was actually a very sensible thing to do by the Trump administration. Now that Biden has canceled that and has reestablished, so to speak, ties with China, that, there maybe needs to be an escalation of a different kind, maybe a more military, geopolitical land related in the Yellow Sea, Taiwan, perhaps South China Sea. So what we're going to essentially be viewing soon, I guess in the next week, is exactly how China will respond to the shooting down of its balloons. But most importantly is that you may ask, well, how do you know these balloons are Chinese? Well, it's already been confirmed by American officials in, I believe, 1 or 2 press conferences, at least, during this weekend on the 4th of February 2023, that yes, indeed, these balloons are Chinese. So they actually do belong to China, and yeah, they are flying over the United States and South America. So exactly what the outcome will be, I guess we'll see in the coming hours, possibly days, and definitely by next week's episode, we'll have a proper synopsis of exactly why this took place. And yeah, again, just as we mentioned with Jay, there is a certain Ukraine fatigue. So most of these stories, as soon as the stories break, they distract the audience and the attention of the people on Twitter, the people on mass media, social media, away from the Ukrainian conflict, because Zelensky is getting boring, of course. People are tired of hearing about him asking for aid. And, we'll speak about the Ukrainian conflict in a bit, but generally speaking, it has been kind of on the downslope in terms of actual searchability, people talking about it, people not Googling it, Ukraine as much. It has fallen in popularity.
Well, I think in many ways, we got to wait for what the Chinese government says. That's not to say that what they would say is gospel, but I'm curious as to how they'll respond. In many ways, this shows, if you listen to my podcast about space with Anthony of Westgate, we know about satellites and their real balloon-like nature in regards. So this is a bit of a curtain drawback moment in that regard, regarding what we're told by NASA and some other things. But as well, we're seeing, I'm literally seeing on Telegram now, Jack Posobiec, Steve Bannon, the usual China hawks. They're having these big headlines and graphics. CCP has violated American airspace over nuclear arsenal. There's that nuclear scare stuff again that we were talking about earlier. So we're really seeing this happen. We know that China ultimately benefits from waiting on the Taiwan thing, and I think hopes to have a more peaceful integration as time goes on. But the U.S., of course, would benefit from stoking China, crossing its red lines, which it has done many times. China has has made it clear that they're not really willing as of this point to really engage Taiwan militarily, but it does seem that the US is willing to keep pushing and pushing to perhaps provoke that conflict sooner so that China's strategic advantages that come with waiting, whether it's the decline of US military power or the decline of Taiwanese nationalism within Taiwan itself and support for the CPC grows there, both of those are to China's advantage, so the US could seek to accelerate a conflict to perhaps prevent those long-term advantages from growing.
Yeah, that's right. And, the best offense is a good defense. So you might say, well, the United States is trillions of dollars in debt. Its military, stocks are actually being flown to the Ukraine as we speak. They're actually being transferred. So stockpiles are running low. How could it actually scare China in sort of, pushing, flying Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan, flying all these politicians to Taiwan, actually giving a show of force? Well, in many ways, like the Ukrainian conflict itself has shown that, if China was to strike upon Taiwan, could US aid actually, bolster up Taiwanese resistance towards China? Nobody really saw Russia being actually slowed down in Ukraine this much. So by supporting Ukraine and holding back the Russian military for almost a year at this point, the US has scared China, I believe, at least slightly, into not considering making any aggressive political moves in its vicinity, in order to basically in order to support its own agenda geopolitically. The US is, of course, not interested in China expanding or regaining any of its formerly lost territories. So, Hong Kong was a concession that was given, but again, Taiwan would be something that China has been eyeing for decades now at this point. But China does see Russia's sort of slight struggles in the Ukraine, and I think it is aware of that. It may face certain struggles of a similar kind in Taiwan if the US begins, of course, buffing up the Taiwanese military as well. I think that's a possibility. I know that's very much in the realm of hypothetical, but nobody really saw 6-7 years ago the same being done to the Ukraine. I mean, nobody had this in their yearly bingo cards, 7-8 years ago. So, yeah, that's definitely a possibility, I think.
And as China, we've seen North Korea throw its explicit support behind Russia in the special military operation. We know there's close collaboration with the Chinese and, of course, the North Koreans. So that could be a hint as to where the tides are going behind the scenes as far as overt support for what Russia's doing. But many are saying that from a geopolitical clash with the West and the Atlantic bloc, like if China goes, it's really over. Whereas in theory, China could perhaps lose Russia in a way, not that they could fight against Russia, but Russia could somewhat be defeated and China would still, have a chance militarily and everything against the powers that be on a long enough timeline. So some of these China hawks who were never super bellicose on Russia to begin with are saying we need to stop diverting all these resources to this silly nonsense in Russia so that we can shore up for a real assault in China, which again, I think both of these are not in the interest of the United States, to say the least. But yeah, we're going to be watching that unfold. But when it comes to World War and other things unfolding, more tanks are being sent to Ukraine. I know in many ways I actually agree with Brian Berletic that this isn't going to make a huge difference. The Russians are going to ploink a lot of these very easily and perhaps even be able to take some of them and learn even more about how to counter Western tanks and artillery on a long enough timeline where the two powers, these blocks actually clash as opposed to through proxies. So I think this isn't going to secure any kind of territorial gain for Ukraine. They're going to eventually have to retreat from Bakhmut, which is being surrounded. But Dmitry has a few more details on the current tank situation, on Abrams, Leopards, and as well as the actual on-the-ground situation.
Yeah, so besides all the howitzers, the munitions, the various types of missiles being sent to the Ukraine, which has already been confirmed by the various smaller nations, inside of NATO, the largest, of course, shipments are the 31 Abrams tanks being sent by the US. Now, the unfortunate development for the Ukrainians here is that the Abrams were delayed by almost a year, at least, or 6 to 12 months. They're saying that the Abrams need to be prepared to be sent to Ukraine. So the question arises: will Ukraine even continue to fight 6 months into 2023 at this point? And the prognosis is not looking too good, especially considering what the outlook is for the near future, starting in spring. Now, so the 31 Abrams are not going to arrive in Ukraine for a little while. Now, what about the German tanks? Now, the 14 Leopards, the Leopard 2 tanks, which are very, very modern German tank, quite a good one actually, being sent to the Ukraine, will arrive perhaps in the next couple of weeks. at this point, or at least 6 to 8 of them will arrive soon, and the rest will arrive a bit later. Now, Germany has announced just a couple days ago in early February 2023 that they're actually sending 88 Leopard 1, which is an older model of tanks. So we have 14 Leopard 2s and 88 Leopard 1s being sent to the Ukraine, which is almost 100 tanks from Germany alone. Now, this raises the number of total tanks being sent by NATO in 2023 to about 200 in total. Now, this is quite a bit, I would say, and yes, it would perhaps cause a difference in the current state of things, where the Russians aren't using that many resources to surround Bakhmut. You know, they're not using the Russians' tank numbers at the moment actively in the field are close to maybe 50 or 100. The Russians aren't using which, mind you, the Russians have thousands of tanks at the moment, like actually in its military, like prepared to run, and probably around 500 which are ready to go at the moment. So yes, 200 tanks right now would cause a huge difference, but not if the Russians begin to utilize their 300,000 mobilized troops in the Ukraine shortly, which these 200, as Conrad said, they're going to be taken out quite soon. Quite soon after being deployed, and yeah, they may slow the Russians down slightly, but they're not going to. It's a drop in the ocean compared to what the Russian military has to show, which frankly we can say perhaps they've shown it to us in full in February and March 2022, but by all accounts, Russia really didn't try hard enough in February and March, and really didn't even attempt to take out any key strategic objectives in those early months of the war. So at this point, the special military operation is very much still leaning in Russia's favor, despite all of these aid packages being sent to the Ukraine. Naturally speaking, of course, 1488 being a very provocative number. I'm not sure why Germany exactly selected this particular number of tanks being sent. Maybe it's an inside joke of some sort, maybe a reference to the neo-Nazi movement in the Ukraine, but the humor kind of takes a backseat here, but it'll definitely be written down in the history books, I believe.
Well, I think the idea of the green government 1488 posting is a little bit funny to me in general. So I think that's I'm kind of glad that'll be in the history books for all the future meme lords and everything. But when it comes to we're going to talk a little bit about persecutions and some of the other things. But when it comes to what's going to happen in the spring, do you have any information or any kind of, I don't know about information, but any kind of insight or idea or guess or whatever it is that as to where you think the focus on that might be, whether it could be towards the Kharkov direction, whether it could again be towards Zaporozhye, as we've kind of seen the beginnings of slow movement, or is it going to be from Belarus? So it's like, is there any kind of indication, whether it's the troop placements or anything and we see the Western media hyping some things up again as they were at the beginning of the special military operation, which is about to reach its year anniversary. What do you see on the horizon here?
Yeah, so essentially, on the Kherson end, we'll start from the south. So around Crimea, Kherson, we don't have much information regarding its defense. We do see Ukrainians are actually conscripting and recruiting Russian as well as Ukrainian citizens of Kherson to man the trenches around that southern area. But besides that, we're not quite sure how robust the Ukrainian defenses are in the south. Now, moving up northwards towards Zaporozhye, the Russians, of course, still use Zaporozhye as the main target after Bakhmut. Now, Zaporozhye, the largest city, Russians haven't pushed much forward into it since the last 2 episodes we've spoken about it. So those first pushes that the Russians have been doing from, which have ranged somewhere between 7 and 14 kilometers deep into Ukrainian defensive lines, they've not been sort of worked and progressed on, not too much. So it does seem like the Russians were simply testing the front line of defense of Zaporozhye. Now, the main target the Russians, of course, have been aiming at was the city of Bakhmut, which is almost surrounded. Russian media sources are reporting that the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut is almost completely surrounded. Now, the Ukrainians still have several brigades and tanks stationed in Bakhmut, which, if surrounded, will of course be left with no other choice than inevitably to surrender. Now, you may say, well, why would they surrender? They should fight to the death. Well, similar to Mariupol, there's really, in modern military senses, there's no way of fighting out of that surrounding. You're getting bombarded by all sides, from all sides by artillery. The Russians can, of course, send in infiltrator squads as mortars from all angles hitting you. There's no way you can actually succeed in not just breaking out, but again, succeeding in actually winning in that battle. So it would be honorable and, of course, respectable for the Ukrainians in Bakhmut to surrender to the Russian army. and of course Wagner, who was leading the surrounding, of course. So this is the result of course, Soledar falling to the Russians 2 to 3 weeks ago, and these are the fruits. Now we're seeing Bakhmut actually fall to the Russians, a huge moral boost to the Russian force. And next, I guess the goal would be Zaporozhye, which is right next door, and we've been speaking about that, but again, we'll need to see what exactly transpires in the coming weeks in February. Now, in the north, of course, there's talk from the Ukrainian media as well as the BBC and United Kingdom media that, hey, the city of Kharkiv may be under siege again soon, that the Russians are amassing 500,000 troops on its borders to attack Ukraine. So Kharkiv is the second largest city in Ukraine. The chance of it falling to Russia, of course, is bleak. Now, obviously Kharkiv is a gigantic city. It has almost 1 million people, I believe more than 1 million. And Russians taking Kharkiv would be probably the greatest feat of this special military operation thus far, much larger than Kherson or Zaporozhye or even Bakhmut at this point. So, and notice the Russians didn't manage to take Kharkiv in February, March 2022. So again, the Ukrainians claiming that Russians are about to strike on Kharkiv a second time in the north of Ukraine is a pretty big claim. Now, we'll just have to see if that transpires or not. So, of course, the media at the moment in the first week of February is claiming that Russia's about to begin assaulting, or at least is preparing for a full-on round 2 assault of Ukraine. Whether or not we see that take place, me and Conrad, of course, have predicted that the end of February, early March will be, around that springtime when the snow will begin to fall and kind of things warm up slightly. That's when the Russians will actually push towards taking more territory from the Ukrainian military. But the media is saying that this may be taking place a lot sooner. I guess we'll just have to see. But yeah, Russians are in a pretty good position at the moment. The taking of Bakhmut, which should fall within maybe a week or two, will of course boost the morale of the Russian side quite significantly at the moment.
Yeah, no, I agree with what you just said there. And another front, before we get into some of these crazy schismatic funeral behavior that Dmitry has prepared for us to talk about, the other thing that we haven't talked about this in a while, in a few episodes to say the least, is that Moldova has been back in the news. And it seems that many Moldovans are expressing their disdain for possible, NATO intervention, and certain NATO groups talking about we need to form a task force to help Moldova, and the president of Moldova is really going all in on being a pro-Westerner and all this kind of stuff. But a recent poll was released conducted in Moldova that revealed that 56% of Moldovans will not take up arms to defend Moldova in case of Russian attack or a Transnistrian attack. And remember, Transnistria is that little sliver on the border with Ukraine from in Moldova that's entirely controlled by Russians and Russian-backed separatists, and I believe there's a Russian military base there. And if things are to ever really go hot with other countries, that's something that Russia is going to be able to mobilize and ultimately have the ability to do a pincer maneuver between their Crimean land bridge and their bases in Transnistria. They would be able to, on a very broad frame, though, they'd be able to kind of outflank the forces within Ukraine. That's always somewhat of a possibility. They've very much shown that they are not taking the gloves off that far, but Moldova as a country does not seem to. The Moldovan church is underneath the Moscow Patriarchate. The bishops there are some of the most anti-globalist bishops in the Orthodox world. Just look up what they said about the vaccine, 5G, other things. I find it very enlightening and very base to say the least. But yeah, no, Moldova is interesting. Do you have any thoughts on that wacky little nation, Dmitry?
Yeah, I think the question of Moldova, of course, Transnistria, all obviously ties into the larger dialectic, and this is, of course, I think, justified dialectic tension between the Romanian nation and the Russian nation, which, Moldova and Transnistria are right there on the border, and there's that huge debate, which is, one of the main contentious points between Romanians and Russians is who controls Moldova. So Moldova technically is home to many people of Romanian heritage, and the church is run by a Russian administration and Russian bishops' control. So there is that, a kind of contentious point as to who runs Moldovan church affairs. Now, this really hasn't been resolved, and if you see any arguments between Russians and Romanians, which, they're both Orthodox peoples, it'll be mainly over that particular area. Romanians claiming that the Russians are either, continuers of the communist sort of status quo or Russian imperialists, and the Russians will claim that Romanians are simply delusional and unaware of history, because Russia did assist the Romanian and Bessarabian people and all the people of those particular countries all the way south into Bulgaria in the 1800s and even 1700s, freeing them from the Turkish Ottoman yoke. So the Turkish Ottoman Empire actually rolled all around the Black Sea, around the left side, basically all the way up to the borders of Ukraine at that time. So all these areas were freed by the Russian Empire at one point in the past. So the fact that Romanians today are, blaming Russians for controlling or having any say in the affairs of those particular territories is a little bit not ungrateful, dare I say. I mean, this is my bias as a Russian, I suppose, but my ancestors did free those areas from Ottoman Turkish rule in the past, right? And so the Turkish yoke was resolved, and the Romanian nation, I think, is quite young in terms of being an Orthodox nation in itself. I think Romania is quite young, and so Romanians are very sort of fiery and feisty in making certain accusations against Russians. So I do think the Moldovan question, it feeds into the fact that, hey, what are Romanian-Russian relations? And they have not always been good. So don't always assume that, hey, Orthodox people are fighting. No, this is something that has roots of about 150 years and is related again to World War II. Romania, of course, siding with the Nazi Germany, and World War I, Romania siding both with Russia and then against Russia. So it's very convoluted, and it definitely is more complicated than simply black and white here, and it depends which perspective you take. Of course, I won't blame Romanians, listening to this podcast, taking the Romanian perspective, because yes, there is a lot of nuance here. So yeah, I do think the Moldovan question feeds into that larger Russian Romanian discourse.
When it comes to Turkey and the Black Sea, Jay was talking about how strategically important the Ukraine and the area around the Black Sea has just been viewed by every relevant empire that's come and gone in that region. So Moldova being periphery to that, and it being really just part of that Black Sea region, is always going to be relevant, as many of the things that we've talked about and predicted come to pass in that region that we've talked about on the show, whether from a prophetic perspective or just as we see right now with military bases and the expansion of just the current hot conflict in Ukraine. But within Ukraine, there's just a lot of the sectarianism and the evil and the kind of what you could call punishable by God behavior is kind of reaching new levels. Dmitry has what is it, the funeral that was going on? I can't remember what city it was in. You could enlighten me a bit.
So essentially, a funeral took place in Kiev of a former neo-Nazi sniper lieutenant named Igor Linzuk. He had the call sign or nickname of Huntsman, right? Like a huntsman spider, I suppose, or somebody like a hunter of Orthodox Christian Russians, which he was famously very good at shooting because he was a pretty good sniper, apparently, it's reported. Now, this neo-Nazi sniper, and why I'm calling him a neo-Nazi is because he was literally a member of the neo-Nazi Azov battalion. He was given a funeral. Of course, he was slain in the line of combat and given a funeral despite not being an Orthodox Christian himself, I believe, or perhaps he was baptized, but he was mostly probably a pagan, being a member of the pagan neo-Nazi Azov battalion. He was given a funeral in a schismatic church, and of course, what was on the coffin, a lid in the church, it was a huge wolf's angel. It's equivalent, I suppose, to putting a huge swastika on the coffin, right, and just having it in the church. So, of course, his Azov battalion comrades were also in the church, standing over Azov flags with various wolf's angels, some blue, some yellow, some black, all kinds of neo-pagan imagery. Of course, yeah, and of course, funerals are, regardless of who passes away, they're a very notable event and, of course, respectable occasion. But a funeral taking place in an Orthodox church is specifically for Orthodox people and for people who've lived Orthodox lives. There are even restrictions in the past. There have been restrictions placed on certain people not being able to, receive an Orthodox funeral upon passing. For example, actors and, people acting in theaters, and, this is going back to old rules in the Orthodox Church. So actors were looked down upon as people of sort of, kind of a perverted lifestyle, and prostitutes as well were never given Orthodox funerals. And in many ways, I believe giving this pagan Azov neo-Nazi or funeral with having a huge wolf's angel neo-Nazi symbol on his coffin is essentially a huge act of sacrilege in the church. And there are, fortunately, right? Fortunately, the church that took place in was a schismatic church led by this schismatic fake bishop Epiphany, Metropolitan of Kiev. And, the fact that it took place in a schismatic church, of course, underlines the fact that, hey, look, were actually willing to endorse and cause a synthesis between this fake church, which we spoke about with Jay, and this neo-Nazi Azov battalion regime. So in many ways, it's like a relationship between Epiphany and Kolomoisky are united here. It's a great synthesis of evil that's happening here in Ukraine. This is just one example of it. So a neo-Nazi funeral in an Orthodox church. Well, I mean, how bad can it get, right?
Well, no, and ultimately you just almost want to just cut it down the middle, give the Uniates Lviv in the very western portion, and let them join Poland, and then just allow the Russians to take the rest and then restore order with the canonical church, because this is just nonsense. And it's the epicenter. Again, this literal neo-Nazi funeral is also the epicenter of contention within global orthodoxy. That, as we talked about with Jay's ultimate roots, is mega ecumenism, liberalism, and just the total destruction of possible union with the papacy in Rome in the future with Patriarch Bartholomew, all of these things. Hence, ultimately, I think are going to find a lot of their roots in Ukraine, with the largest Uniate group of, Greek Byzantine Catholics, as they're called in Ukraine, styling themselves as Orthodox, as well as, of course, that brings in the Vatican presence, as well as, of course, the schismatics and the expansion of territory from the State Department controlled ecumenical patriarchs. So it all comes down to this, I think, is true perversion of orthodoxy that is a very central tenet to this conflict that, of course, no one in the West talks nor cares about. So I think in many ways people need to remember that. And it's really only, I've said it before and it sounds like dramatic or it sounds like propaganda or whatever, but the only solution I see to some of this is just more and more territory and more of these parishes falling under the control of the Russian Federation, especially in the territory that's already officially Russian.
Yeah, it seems that throughout the conflict, Russians have been the ones who've actually respected the religious rights of all these various religions and also haven't encroached upon religious freedoms of any sort. But of course, primarily we're concerned for the Orthodox Church, and the freedom and protection of the Orthodox Church has not been provided for by Zelensky. On the opposite side, he's actually openly announced persecution against it. So, and many Orthodox bishops have cursed him, have anathematized him, and also disconnected anyone who's participating in these persecutions from the church and from God himself. So it's already been done. Anathemas have been read out and curses have been given. These are ultimatums which a person needs to repent of the sins in order to return back into communion with God. So these are really important, I think, things which have taken place. And I think it's kind of reflective of just the fact that look, Russians are actually waking up to what's happening in the world and their place in world history. I think Russians have woken up from their 30-year, maybe 100-year slumber, and actually have realizing that, hey, we actually do need to protect Orthodoxy because nobody else will in Eastern Europe. Now, I guess on that note, there was a really, I guess, really controversial post or even series of posts by a huge account on Twitter run by Orthodox Russians. It's called Russians with Attitude. Now, Russians with Attitude, of course, runs a podcast as well as a Substack, and they post a lot of news about the Ukraine-Russian conflict. And recently, they've had a certain breaking of the ice, I suppose. One of their contributors wrote an entire thread basically discussing the fact that the way Russia views the Soviet Union was in fact in a negative sense. So the Soviet Union actually didn't contribute much towards Russia, or at least not as much as some communists claim. And they had this big, essentially spilling out of truth onto Twitter. And one of the things they mentioned, of course, was the fact that, hey, Yeltsin actually caused the destruction of the lives of many Russian people, which of course is true. Me and Conrad both agree with that. They've also claimed that, look, the Soviet Union was a very exploitative and leeching system for the various minorities inside the USSR, which leached on the larger Russian nation, of course. And this is shown as well in statistics and archives from the Soviet Union, which showed exports and imports to various smaller nations or smaller nation states within the Soviet Union, such as Georgia, such as Estonia, Lithuania, and even Ukraine. So smaller nations in the USSR actually gained more from being members of the USSR rather than RSFSR, which was Russia. So the Russians actually suffered more under the Soviet Union than the smaller nations which were members of it. So they actually went on to speak about that, and quite in depth, and this triggered a lot of people online. Now, I thought the coolest part of their post was the mentioning that, hey, look, Saint Nicholas II, the last Orthodox Russian emperor, was an outstanding statesman. He led Russia to triumph, and he was slandered. He did not sign any abdication, and that is all propaganda. He and his family died the deaths of martyrs, and the truth was always on his side. Now, I mean, this is a very controversial post, because on one hand, he's of course claiming that Nicholas II was a great statesman, which of course me and Conrad agree, because we've read the actual history books as well as the primary text. This is not really a contention among serious historians. Now, two, he claims that the abdication document in late February, March of 1917 was not signed by Nicholas II, and this is probably one of the most, I would say, contentious and questionable positions that Russia's attitude has held for a long time now. Because what this means is that the Russian emperor never abdicated. He was forced into house detention and then subsequently murdered, and still withheld power within his authority. He never tapped out. He never became like Vucic, a cuck of Kosovo, which, he wasn't a Pontius Pilate who washed his hands and said, no, okay, the Jews of Jerusalem can have Christ. I'm washing my hands. I'm not in charge anymore. The Russian emperor didn't do that if he didn't sign, this apparent abdication document. So the claim, of course, is now being investigated by historians. Only in the last 20 years this has begun, and Russians of attitude is aware of these investigations and sides with the opinion, of course, of me, as well as Pyotr Multatuli and other great historians in Russia at the moment, who agree that, hey, no abdication document was signed. This has huge implications on Russian history, which has always slandered St. Nicholas, calling him a weak ruler. At least the communists and liberals have. Even some Orthodox people, they've said, hey, look, this guy actually signed the abdication document. He's a weak ruler. Like, he wasn't ready to stand and die for his country, for his role as the Tsar and Orthodox emperor. Orthodox emperors don't abdicate normally. Like, why would he abdicate and give power to the Freemasons and communists? Like, that seems like a betrayal of his duty. That's like asking a bishop to, go into retirement forcibly, defrocking himself. Like, this is something which is incredibly controversial, but it has been taken as the status quo for decades now. And of course, Russians of attitude pushing this Orthodox-based red-pilled opinion and putting it out onto Twitter for everybody to see is a huge step, I think, in waking a lot of people up, including a lot of Russians.
Well, I think as well, just look at Tsar Nicholas's life. I mean, he fought tooth and nail to not even sign the 1905 concessions and, the constitutional nature of the monarchy. And he only did it because he realized it would save lives, because the people would fight against it if he didn't. But in the context of having already also received what we believe is the prophecy from Saint Seraphim of Sarov, between all the other evidence, there's just no... It really truly doesn't make a lot of sense why he would have just abdicated and signed it away with everything that he knew was going on with the war and with everything. So it's I think in many ways people should dive into it. It's a fascinating history, of course, but I'm glad that Russians with Attitude are one of the biggest, if not the biggest, kind of Russian English language voice on Twitter and on YouTube in a lot of ways on this stuff. Is they're on the correct side, as opposed to, not to hate on Anatoly Karlin or others, but some of these other not you might not say Orthodox big O and little O, those positions are not necessarily the norm among Russian nationalists, and it seems that the tide of orthodoxy and true pride in Orthodox tradition is taking root.
Yeah, that's right. There's no shame in saying that, look, Orthodox saints make mistakes, and Nicholas II probably made mistakes as well, and Russians of attitude would agree there, and even of course, Nicholas II would probably agree himself that, yes, he has made mistakes, but to claim that, the whole empire basically tapped out and threw itself away, I think, is against the... going basically against history. And Conrad correctly noted that during the Russian Revolution of 1904-1905, when in 1906 Nicholas did sign the Russian Constitution, which was a very limited document by all accounts. Like, you can read it. It's actually probably, if the Russian Constitution of the early 1900s was in power now, it'd be the most based constitution in the world. It had some pretty amazing articles in it, and actually it's not comparable to any modern constitution, even the American one. It's extremely orthodox, actually, in its written text. Now, the fact that St. Nicholas II was bullied and forced essentially into signing that document, I think provided the various newspapers and media outlets, which, mind you, I'm not going to mention it, but somebody did control most of the media outlets in Russia at the time, as well as Kiev and all the major cities. This is the stats already out, and even the saints at the time wrote about exactly who controlled in 1917, 1905 most of the media outlets, especially the newspapers, which was the main source of news for people, who controlled all of these companies. Now, you can go investigate it for yourself, dear listener, but yes, That's part of the puzzle, right? Now, of course, faking the abdication, like this is the last thing I'll say on this issue, but faking the abdication would have been a lot easier, because you can simply say, well, Nicholas II, he signed that document in 1906? Yeah, well, he signed another document in 1917. It's just the continuation. He's just kind of doing his thing. He signed one in 1906. He signed one this year as well. Like, it's a lot more... the conspiracy here is that 1917 was only possible because of 1906, and it was probably in the plans, actually, of the conspirators and of the Freemasons who forced both these documents into signature. And the second one, even if it was fake, it was easier to fake because the first one was signed. So you get it. It's a long-term plan for these people, similar to how their idea was, if they ever wanted to force a war between Russia and Ukraine, they needed to start the Maidan ahead of time. So they planned long-term. These globalists, these enemies of humanity, these Satanists, they plan things ahead of time and they execute them in steps and stages. So 1906 made the abdication false document of 1917 possible. And yet, of course, unfortunately, it's up to us Orthodox Christians to have the foresight to actually see these negative events coming, and I'm not preaching to the choir. You guys all know that, foresight is required. But again, it's very difficult to sort of see these things coming. I don't think any Orthodox saints even saw the idea that the Russian Empire would be overturned in such a conspiratorial fashion. I mean, the saints said it clairvoyantly, but beyond clairvoyance, there was really no real prediction of it, and essentially no detailed explanation of how it would take place. Nobody really saw it coming here.
I think this is a good place to start wrapping up, and it shows, as we talked about with Jay, the epistemological question here, just how do you discern what's going on in the world? Stick with the saints, stick with the elders. Even in the midst of division within Orthodoxy, while most holy people are obviously on the side of the majority of patriarchs and bishops in the church against the schism in Ukraine, even those few saintly people that are, perhaps due to jurisdictional issues on the other side, have been very much correct on the major issues. I mean, take many African bishops. Archbishop Makarios, who unfortunately has, I believe, the incorrect opinion on Ukraine, he was able to protect tens of thousands of his Kenyan flock from receiving the vaccination due to what I believe is just his saintly phronema and his having been raised and been brought up by saintly people and possessing that saintly deposit. Just as we say, having listened to the words of Metropolitan Neophytos, St. Paisios, Father Seraphim Rose, St. Gabriel Urgabadze, St. Lawrence of Chernigov, these beacons and lights throughout the horrors that are the 20th and 21st centuries, allow people of simple faith even to see through the psyops, to see through nonsense, to see through BS. And that's, for better or for worse, not to pat ourselves on the back. We know we fail every day, but we do our best to kind of bring that to you in podcast form here. So with all that being said, Dimitri, unless you have any last words, we can maybe give the plugs and sign off here.
Yeah, so thank you everybody for listening, and big thank you for Jay, for just coming on here and actually giving his opinion on all these controversial and yet very relevant subjects. It's always interesting to hear somebody as learned and as plugged in as Jay in order to, to give his opinion on these things, and it's always welcome, of course. We really appreciated it, and I think me and Conrad are, pretty stoked to actually see what the week has in store for us, especially with these balloons going down, with apparently the media reporting that Russia has moved its forces up to the border. Like, there's a lot of things which of course we'll be reporting throughout the week. Maybe we'll even have a Twitter space around Wednesday or Thursday of this coming week. So just just be prepared, guys, to stay in contact, comment on the Substack, comment on the YouTube videos, send us DMs on Twitter, be involved with us as we explore some of these big media stories coming up.
Yeah, no, and with all that, it's worldwarnow.substack.com. On Twitter, it's worldwarnow_. On YouTube, it's just search World War Now. We come right up. Subscribe to the channel if you're listening on Substack. If you're listening on YouTube, worldwarnow.substack.com. That's where you got to be. That's where the info comes out, especially on Substack. We have a Telegram, of course, that we're really trying to get to 1,000 subs, so hit us over there, World War Now, TELE. That's what you got to type in. If not, just type in World War Now on the search on Telegram as well. My Twitter is GnomeRad. Dimitri's Twitter is OCanonist, Orthodox Canonist. Follow Jay as well. We'll have all of Jay's links and everything below. Again, thanks to him. Really fantastic, and looking forward to seeing him in Austin, as we discussed. Yeah, with all that being said, so I'll put all those links in the description on YouTube or Substack. And again, keep the church in prayer, keep the world in prayer and everything. And with all that, God bless. We'll see y'all next time.